where Big Dan does most of his work down here. You may want to put your shoe on for these little bits and pieces. This is where the magic happens. Most of these shelves right here. There's papers and all these little shelves. It's the capacitors that you would use. This is where the resistors would be.
Dan?
Dan?
Dan. Dan. Dan.
Dan?
Dan. 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 Dan.
Dan?
Dan.
Dan?
Dan. Dan.
Dan?
Dan.
Dan?
Dan.
Oh my god! Big Dan! Oh my god! Oh! I love Big Dan! Oh!
Big Dan.
Big Dan! Big Dan!
Big Dan. Big Dan.
Dan!
Big Dan. Big Dan. Big Dan.
He disappeared into the night.
Big Dan has been a great person. Big Dan.
Big Dan owns your life.
We can't. It's like a capacitor.
Fucking Big Dan again.
Right, let's get past
Does it ever end, guys?
Big Dan fucking understands.
Big Dan is Greg's dad. Big Dan, he's everybody.
I'm about to draw Big Dan.
Big Dan said